from what we could see, by applying an electric charge to different parts of this structure, it would bend quite easily.
Really?
Yeah, it's again something very difficult to describe without drawing it exactly how this operated. But it was not made of in a telescopic form where you'd see something like a car antenna where it would collapse down on each section would collapse down onto one another. It was a solid piece, if you can imagine, just a solid piece of pipe, and applying an electric charge to it and having the pipe bend but remain rigid after it had done so. Anyway, this compromised composed the focusing system for these three amplifiers. They received signals from other parts of the craft. The amplifiers would focus in on a certain point, and this is basically how the amplifiers were aimed. And the craft had, again, it's kind of a lengthy explanation, but there were two different modes the craft we found would operate in. One is called Omicron, and one is called Delta. The Omicron configuration was the standard operating mode of the craft, and it's where it used one single amplifier to maintain its elevation in the sky. One of the other amplifiers was rotated 90 degrees and essentially pointed straight out ahead of the craft. So with one amplifier working, it essentially produced an anti-gravitational pillar to stand on. With the amplifier that was rotated 90 degrees, instead of what we would normally think along the lines of propulsion, where a jet would essentially exhaust material, hot gases out the back,
right?
Where we would normally think along the lines of a propulsive force, what the craft did was essentially create a distortion in front of it.
A distortion now.
A gravitational distortion.
Is that like sort of creating a well, in effect?
Exactly. It would create a little distortion, a divot in time-space, if you want to call it that. A well is a good analogy, too, to where the craft would actually, this is kind of the low-performance mode, if you want to give it a name, but where the craft would actually continuously slide downhill.
Yes.
A very awkward, strange mode of propulsion. I mean, we have nothing that would even really relate to something like that. But it's kind of backwards, if you see what I'm saying.
I do.
The other mode of propulsion...
And before we go to that, you would imagine this mode of propulsion to be used in what configuration? In other words, in an atmosphere, for example?
In an atmosphere, just maneuvering around small objects.
Source of gravity, probably near a planet or moon, would you say?
I would imagine so, yeah. I don't think it would be used in space. There would be some, by definition of this mode, it requires some force, some large amount of gravity to be acting on the craft. So you would have to be near some sort of gravitational body.
All right.
I would imagine as it was hovering around the ground, this is what would it.
All right, makes sense. And then there was another mode.
The other mode is the delta configuration, and this is how it normally travels through space and makes large jumps. The craft flies with the belly facing the direction you want to go, not as you would normally see the craft in a science fiction movie.
Ah.
The gravity amplifiers are all brought up to power, and they're focused on a single point. This point now becomes an area of intense gravitational distortion, many, many times more than what we were talking about before. And this is where the true warp drive comes into effect. This is where you actually bend, you begin to distort space and time. And instead of the craft actually flying, you're basically distorting the fabric of space around the craft and move without actually traveling. You're not moving in a
so
linear.
if I'm visualizing this correctly, it's kind of like the other mode, except far more intense, and you're constantly moving toward this warp, or with this warp. I don't know which way to think about it.
Well, you actually become part of the other space. It's a pretty wild concept, but something that really isn't unknown to us. As I've stated before, to most people this sounds like wild science fiction. However, we know most of these things are possible. We know, for example, as I stated in that tape, that we can see stars that are behind the sun. And the reason for that is the intense gravitational field of the sun bends not just light, but it bends space around the sun, and we can see some things behind it. We know that we know space, gravity, and time are all interrelated. We know this for a fact. We know that around areas of intense gravitational fields, time essentially slows down. I mean, it's certainly been theorized that if one was to orbit a black hole, an area of tremendous gravitational distortion of gravity will, for instance, that time would virtually stop.
Right.
So with all these things interacting, this is how you can travel a great distance with essentially no time elapsing. First of all, you're bending space towards you. By doing that, you're actually slowing time. Not to say that this is a time machine, it's just a byproduct. Whenever you produce a gravitational field, whenever you're around an intense gravitational field, time slows. It's just
Bob,
the way it is.
Bob, did you discern all of this yourself after long examination? Oh, no, this was...
Absolutely not.
Okay, they gave you this then.
Right. Mm-hmm.
All right, and so, God, you've got... so then you're in the craft. Then your job, I guess, is to go back to the gravity amplifier and the rest of it that they've already got assembled and try and back engineer the thing or try to make it work with materials that we have here on Earth. Is that correct?
Basically so. Well, basically is to start at the very beginning and look at the reactor and try and see how from ground level the device operates. And this is where apparently I came in to the project.
All right, and that is where we must pause. Back now to Bob Lazar and Gene Huff. Gene, basically the silent one right now, sort of helping out as he can. Let's see, Bob, in the interest of time, because, we could spend 10 hours with this, perhaps not before you fell asleep, but...
Well, we did make some coffee here. I detected I started rambling and not saying anything, so hopefully this will help. We are about 3 hours past my bedtime.
I see. I appreciate it. The nation appreciates it. This really is an incredible story. Now, briefly, you went to work, obviously, trying to back engineer this.
Right.
How far did you get and what did you learn?
Well, not very, and I need to digress for a moment here, and this is where I learned one of the reasons why I was hired. Initially, our work started on the reactor. We figured that's the center point of everything, and this is where we should really concentrate our efforts, and apparently that's what the people before me did, too. Apparently, there was an attempt to analyze the operation of one of these reactors, and I got to read the notes that the gentleman before me had left. There was a fatality, or actually 3 fatalities, if I remember, when they attempted to do this. For some reason, they attempted to get into the reactor while it was in operation under load, and it was never very clear in their notes as to why anyone decided to do that. However, again, in the interest of time, I'll cut this short, but they did attempt to do that. The reactor did explode, and the gentlemen were killed. I was to replace one of these people.
Great.
So this is...
Did anybody at any point suggest that you go in?
Oh, no. I think this is something... I think they reached a point of frustration, couldn't get anywhere, and, went on from there. Again, this didn't sound very sensible to me, but this was a story that was relayed to me, and just something I thought I'd pass along.